When it comes to reading files, less is more, but most isn't less, and bat is a cat with wings. I hope that made absolutely no sense, because this is how it feels to read the man page of some of these newer file paginating commands. So I want to start off, does anyone even read files in the terminal? But why would we ever do that? We have these great windowing systems. Well, sometimes it's inconvenient to leave the terminal, or you don't have access to a windowing system. Say you're connected to a remote server, and it's just a little bit of a hassle to get a windowing system to pipe through X11 back to your local machine in order to visually inspect something. And usually, even when you can do that, your options are limited. You have the really poor kind of font choices or really blocky layouts. If I'm going to go blocky, just keep it in the terminal, right? Save me the hassle. And so today we'll be exploring a few options for reading files within your terminal, or for really just digesting their output or their content and spitting out in standard out. We have cat, we have pygmentize, and we have bat. Bat is also known as batcat, but you'll hear me refer to it as bat, just to kind of alleviate some confusion. And so in case we're not familiar, cat is just an easy way to parse contents of the file and spit it back out into your terminal session. So here I've read in preprocess.py, and you can see its output right there at the bottom. You can even read in multiple files. Cat is not the name of an animal. Well, it is, but in this case, it's short for concatenate. And so what cat excels at doing is opening up a stream, piping in the contents of one file and then the next, and doing that in a way so that you can pipe it around to multiple different processes or different commands. And so what you can see here is when we concatenate multiple files, we can throw in a -n flag to get the line count. And you can see that it's squished all four of these files, I believe, on top of each other and spat it out into standard out. So what's the big deal? How can we improve on that? Why would we need to? Well, pygmentize takes it a step further, but also in a slightly different direction. Pygmentize is for syntax highlighting. And so if you ever want to read the contents of a file, if it's a script of really any sort, pygmentize is very flexible. It's not just for Python. It will give you out really nice syntax highlighted content. What pygmentize does not do is support multiple files. We'll see, right, I can only do one file at a time. That's because pygmentize is not meant for concatenation like cat is. But one of my favorite things about pygmentize is that you're not limited to just spitting it out to your shell. You can save it as an HTML file, and then you can, if you have the pygmentize CSS on your server, you can load that up, and then everyone else who visits your website will see your nice syntax highlighted code. And as a bonus, if you subscribe to our newsletter, I will have you know that this is how we perform syntax highlighting within our newsletter. We have to pass this no classes equals true flag in order, because we don't have access to the CSS since it's an email. So what this does is, instead of putting classes into each of our HTML elements, it will actually perform inline styling. So next time you read our newsletter, make a thought, oh, Cameron must have piped this into pygmentize. And so the difference between these two tools is that cat directs the contents of a file to standard out, and human readability is just a byproduct of that, right? It's not really designed for people to be looking at and reading through, right, multiple files stacked on top of one another. Then what's the point of bat? Well, we can see bat here. Wow. So when we run bat on preprocess.py, we get this really nice looking output. And it's a modern tool after all, right? So the output should look very fancy. But we can see we have the name of the file, and we even get syntax highlighting without pygmentize. That's just fantastic. What happens when we try to give it multiple files? Will it still concatenate? Absolutely. And in addition to concatenating, just like cat would, right, we have this very nice human readable output. And if you pay close attention to file2.txt, it's the third file down, you'll see that every line has a plus, and the file below that, every line has a tilde. Could that be Git support? Is that because file2.txt is new and file 3 has been modified or deleted? Oh man, so not only do I get nice human readable output, but I get built-in Git support? Fantastic. And of course, if you're using Batcat and you say, I don't care about human readability, just concatenate the contents of my files, you can pass the -pp option, which is to prevent paging and it prevents the coloring. And so you just end up with the same output that you would end from cat. So what else can you use cat for, right? Like I said, it's used to concatenate multiple files, and then you can pipe all of that input into another process or into another command. You'll see here that I'm using a RG, which is short for ripgrep. It is the new version of grep that I'll get into in a moment. But what I'm doing here is I'm reading all of the files, file.txts, and then I'm piping it into ripgrep, and I'm saying, hey, count the number of times, or show me where we see 2 or more L's next to each other. Give me those lines back. And you can see here that I have line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, and 12. They're all in standard input though. Okay, so that's maybe, I wonder why that would be. We lost a little bit of granularity. It's because ripgrep can take files, multiple files, and grep does this as well, as input. And it will use those file names in order to sort your output for you. When we pre-concatenate everything together and then pipe it into ripgrep, it has no idea that different files ever existed. So we have to be careful when we use cat, because it sometimes can prevent us from using features of other tools, especially if they already accept multiple files as an input. Next, I want to get into file paginators, right? We've looked a lot into things that will spit out files for us into our standard output, but what if I just want to read them? So here you can see I've opened a terminal. As per rules and regulations, I have typed ls. And so if we want to explore, let's say, the oldest file paginator, and explore all of our files we have here, we can see I type more file txt to read them all in. Okay, it looks like we have to go one at a time. I hit enter to advance to the next line, and I keep hitting enter. Okay, we've read all our files. Do I really want that still sitting there in my terminal session? Not really, right? If I wanted it to all just sit there in my terminal session, I would have just concatenated it all together and spat it out. This is what tools like less warrant us. Less, honestly, is just the new more, and it's better in every way. So less, we can parse each file, get to the next one, we can read, okay, now at the bottom of my screen you can see I'm at file 2, I go to the next one, I'm at file 3 now, next one, and when I'm done, I can just quit with Q. Oh, it's not sitting there in my terminal session. This is fantastic. But we have a couple more options to explore. We have things like view. And if you're not familiar with view, you might be familiar with vim. If you are familiar with vim, this is just a read-only buffer for vim. And so the best part about view is that you don't have to learn any new keyboard shortcuts, any new commands. If you already know vim, you can navigate it just as well as any other session. So to go to the next tab here, right, I have all these tabs, and look, oh my gosh, since I have Vim plugin set up, I see the get diff on the line-by-line get diff. Fantastic. And so there's one more file pagination command I wanted to show everyone today, and that is most. So first we had more, and then we had less. And the catch line on less is that less is more, is less is better than more, but is most better than less? Well, most is kind of the same thing as less. The really neat thing about most is I can scroll side to side, which is pretty dandy if you have really wide files. There's you can force it to auto wrap if you want, but that's not necessary. And I can navigate between files here, right? I can go back between files to the next one, etc. And so most is pretty handy if you want to read multiple files, but is it handier than less? Not really, in my opinion. Less does mimic a lot of the Vim keyboard shortcuts, and so it makes it just a little bit easier to adapt if you're familiar with Vim. And if you want to use the command line, I would just highly recommend just use Vim. I started using it recently, and I think James will be very excited to hear my synopsis of these tools. And that is, when it comes to file pagination, the Vue, Vim, whatever, honestly, that is the way to go in my opinion. Less is great, and more is fine. The only time that you'll probably encounter more is if you're working on a very small machine. The code base for more is about 2,000 lines, whereas the code base for less is about 27,000. So a lot of these small machines, if they come pre-installed with any type of file pagination, it will be more. And then thinking back to things like batcat or pygmentize, I would say that these are separate tools. Yeah, they both support syntax highlighting. Batcat even does support pagination. However, it uses less as a backend to do that, which is why I didn't bother to show it. But you get that really nice pagination with the syntax highlighting and all that. So if you don't have your Vim configured properly, I would recommend using batcat. Pygmentize is great. You get a syntax highlighter that works and has various output formats. In my opinion, batcat is greater than the sum of its parts, that being cat and less. You get the optional pagination, syntax highlighting, and built-in Git support. Less is just better than more. I'm just going to be kind of frank out of the gate here. There's no real reason to use more unless, like I said, you're working with a small device that doesn't have a lot of memory. And then lastly, most is kind of similar to less, which can be similar to Vue depending if you use Vim, and two, you have all the fancy fun plugins installed.